thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be here and talk a bit about maybe more normative topic. I will try to tackle a bit the question if there should or be a right to destroy cultural heritage that is normally a bit far away from the typical everyday experience of archaeologists, because normally we are concerned of protection and preservation, right? So at first, archaeology seems to be much more connected to preservation and protection of cultural objects than the destruction. Not only in excavations, archaeologists themselves are dealing directly with destruction, but also in heritage-related activities. So when there's a decision about what to protect and what to preserve, this is also making an exception from it being destroyed or leaving it for decay. So in the following presentation, I will give a look at the destruction of cultural objects, and I will do this by trying to use the metaphor of the biography of objects that maybe some of you might know, but I will present it quickly. And we will have a quick look at some cases from Europe and the Americas to reflect on the practices of protection, preservation, and destruction of cultural objects. And also, I will highlight that the legitimate destruction of heritage is not an exception, but a democratic and politically justified everyday experience. We can for sure discuss this very critically or afterwards or also in the coming days, as we have already heard about some cases of destruction that are also very interesting. So, but considering the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I will argue that the explicit right of Indigenous peoples to have control over their own cultural manifestations also implies the right on destruction. And this is maybe interesting for this conference because maybe we are just in the struggle, in the crisis of the control over heritage, more specifically material cultural objects that are part of museum collections, mostly in Europe and the United States. And this as a result, basically, of imperialism and colonization, also later experiences of global north, global south, and asymmetries that will be interesting. So maybe let's start with the biography of objects. So this concept has become famous, basically since Igor Kopytov in 1983 used it in his essay Cultural Biography of Things, Commoditization as a Process, and applied it on the different stages an object undergoes within its existence. So more explicitly, he is interested in the moment when an object changes states of existence, when it loses its status as a commodity. So he writes that doing the biography of things means asking questions similar to those one asks about people. Here to quote, what sociologically are the biographical possibilities inherent in its status and in the period and culture, and how are these possibilities realized? So it's about the career, about the life of an object, and also, which is mostly not taken into account, maybe the death and the design, the destined death and the wished end of this career. So this concept has also received a lot of criticism because as a theory, it puts us in front of various problems, but I will leave them aside, like more questions regarding that to answer them. But I think that it's very useful as a metaphor and to talk just about the life of objects, also because it's ontologically broad. So there are different concepts about reality, like how the world is constituted, what objects are, also the divide between objects and subjects is a frequently criticized separation in the Western world that is questioned by indigenous peoples, for example. And like, just to give one example, for example, Fernando Sanz-Granero, who's an anthropologist, describes that the Yanesha, an indigenous group in the northeast of Peru, are using, for example, the term S to describe that things, like it's similar to word thing, but it implies a lot more. It implies a certain agency, it implies a certain way of being alive that would maybe not be considered the same way in typical Western perspectives. So the being of an object implies an idea of its identity and a conception of its interaction with humans. Focusing on the social life of an object permits to identify the ideas which constitute this object and its meanings, and also its including its end. So I'll jump to the legitimate destruction. Or can there be legitimate destruction? It's a very difficult question connected to our ideas about politics, about ethics. And also there are some authors who write about the destruction of culture being the same as the destruction of objects of archaeological value, for example. But in different cases, it is a broad topic which is openly discussed, but in general, destruction is considered to be bad. Because it poses two major problems. First, it causes negative affections. So, as we have heard, like losing objects that are of value might hurt people, and depending on the ethical point of view, in any case, this is something we should avoid. And the second one, this is already a bit more a positivistic perspective, is that it is a loss of information. So we're talking about idealized political systems, which really give, basically represent the interests of the people. We could say that there can be institutions that grant legitimacy to destroy. Here's just one example. This is like a piece of art for which basically a hand had to be dropped. But I won't keep it there just for illustration. But I would like to present you another example. This is an everyday experience from Germany, basically. This church has been destroyed in 2018 as the result of the exploitation of lignite, like brown coal. And also, basically every day there are villages disappearing. We are basically reforming entire landscapes for getting resources we need for making energy. And this is also, you could say, if it were like in a political idealized way, a legitimate destruction of cultural heritage, and it is even against the will of the people living there. So that is basically a point of discussion, but I think there can be legitimate destruction. So the question is a bit, how does the control, how do we control life of objects? And the paradigm of protection and preservation has been criticized all along, and but also by Laura Jane Smith, who writes about the issue of control over heritage is political because it is a struggle over power. Not only because different interests will have different and usually unequal access to resources of power, but also because heritage is itself a political resource. I think this is, here it becomes interesting, because if we take that protection and preservation is a thing and also destruction is a thing, the question is who decides about that? And here we come in the situation, here we have the situation that mostly, for example, in the Americas, indigenous peoples have been marginalized and have not been included in decisions about heritage making in a national sense. And since, we could say maybe in the last 30 years, much the discourse on an international level is opening up for including marginalized and before silenced voices. And just to give you also a quick example of in which cases, for example, the destruction of an object can be necessary is, I quote from the Protocols for Native American Archival Materials from 2007. It's a group of representatives of indigenous peoples in the United States who basically say that not every artificial prolonging of the life of documents, but also objects, is desirable. So, talking about cultural autonomy of indigenous peoples, maybe the most important source is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And in the Article 11.1, they say indigenous peoples have the right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs. Here I highlight this includes the right to maintain, protect, and develop the past, present, and future manifestations of their cultures, such as archaeological and historical sites, artifacts, designs, ceremonies, technologies, and visual and performing arts and literature. So based on that, I would also say this includes the complete power of decision about the entire life cycle of an object and also its destruction. But of course, this can be very difficult because we come in situations where objects do not only matter to indigenous groups, but also to, for example, the museums, which were taking care of these objects. They have, in some cases, belonged for a lot of time to other societies who also might have like a legitimate idea about how to deal with these objects and preserve them. So I will, to end, maybe Ian Potter has already mentioned these discussions more than 10 years ago, and he was trying to shift a bit of the perspective from like general right and property towards the question, to whom does it matter most? To whose well-being is it more important? So I think in this context, there are many discussions out there to have and to decide on in the future. And I think based on that, I would argue for the right of destruction and also explicitly underline that, as it is currently not the case. Yeah, thank you very much for that attention and for, yeah, that's it.